The spirits of a mother and child. Eternal echoes. Summary. In a desolate village steeped in superstition, David, a determined farmer, ventures out one eerie night to hunt frogs, hoping to provide for his struggling family. The misty fields seem alive with whispers of the unknown, and David stumbles upon an enigmatic woman cradling a silent child. Her hollow eyes and the haunting lullaby she hums chill him to the core. Invited to her ramshackle home, David senses something deeply unnatural as he drinks from her water. His journey back grows stranger when the frogs he caught turn to blackened soil, and his infant son begins to cry uncontrollably at his touch. Over the following days, tragedy unfolds. The crops fail, his son's health worsens, and the woman's ghostly presence lingers near his home. Desperate, David returns to find her house gone, replaced by a forgotten grave. The horrifying truth dawns: she and her child are spirits bound by grief, seeking something David cannot give. The story crescendos into a chilling finale as David's family vanishes, leaving the villagers haunted by the ghostly lullaby that still echoes at night. A tale of survival, love, and terror, this gripping narrative explores the unrelenting power of the supernatural and the fragility of human hope. Part 1. A village of shadows. The village of Hollowshade lay cradled between endless stretches of misty fields and a dense, ancient forest. The air always seemed thick with something unseen, a presence that lingered just beyond the edge of reason. By day, the village bustled with the faint hum of survival, the soft clinking of tools in the fields, the laughter of children, and the occasional chatter of market-goers. But by night, an unsettling stillness settled over the land. Shadows stretched long and deep, swallowing the crooked paths and crumbling cottages, as though the darkness itself sought to claim the village. For generations, the people of Hollowshade had whispered of the curse. Stories passed from trembling lips around flickering hearths told of restless spirits wandering the fields, their grief so heavy it seeped into the soil. The tale spoke of sudden deaths, unexplainable illnesses, and wailing cries that carried on the wind during the blackest hours. The elders swore these were warnings, signs of the village's grim fate, but David refused to believe. David was a man of practicality, molded by the hardships of farm life. His hands were calloused, his face weathered by sun and toil. With a young wife and an infant son to care for, David had little patience for the village's superstitions. He had heard the stories as a child, his mother's voice trembling as she told him to never wander past the old sycamore tree after dark. Yet, he dismissed them as remnants of an ignorant past. Even now, as the whispers grew louder, David remained unconvinced. Just last week, an elder had claimed to see the spirit of a weeping woman in the rice paddies. 2 days later, young Liam, the blacksmith's apprentice, was found dead, his body pale and his lips stained black. "It's the curse," the villagers murmured, their faces pale and eyes darting. "She's coming for us." David's wife, Eleanor, shared their fear. Her soft brown eyes, usually steady and warm, now darted anxiously toward the windows at dusk. She would press Peter, their infant son, closer to her chest whenever the wind howled. "David, maybe we should leave," she had whispered one night, her voice barely audible over the creak of their wooden home. "There's something wrong here. I feel it." But David only sighed, his patience fraying. "Eleanor, we've worked too hard to abandon this place. Stories don't put food on the table. The fields do. If we leave now, what do we have?" Still, as he lay in bed that night, listening to the wind moan through the cracks, a chill crept down his spine. He told himself it was the draft, nothing more. The next day, a grim tension hung over the village. A gathering formed near the old well, the hub of the community. As another piece of tragic news spread, old Martha, the midwife, had vanished. Her door was found ajar, her humble home untouched, but there were no footprints leading away, only an eerie stillness. "The spirits have taken her." The whispers began again. David shook his head as he overheard the talk. "Spirits don't take people. Wolves, maybe. Or a thief passing through. But not spirits." An older man, haggard and thin, glared at him. "You'll regret dismissing the warnings, David. Mark my words. The curse doesn't spare skeptics." That evening, Eleanor's unease grew unbearable. She begged David to stay indoors, to ignore the frogs croaking in the fields that promised a bountiful catch. Please, she pleaded, her voice breaking. The frogs will still be there tomorrow, but the pang of hunger was sharper than her fear. The pantry was nearly bare, and their son's cries of hunger haunted David more than any ghost. I'll be fine, he said, forcing a smile. It's just a few hours. I'll be back before you know it. As David prepared to leave, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, mournful sound of melody, almost like a woman's voice. Eleanor stiffened. Do you hear that? She asked, her voice trembling. David paused, listening. The sound faded, swallowed by the rustling leaves. It's just the wind, he said firmly, though his own heart raced. Lock the door behind me. I'll be back soon. He stepped out into the night, the lantern in his hand casting a dim, wavering light. The path to the fields was familiar, yet tonight it felt different. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches twisting like grasping hands. The air was thick with an unplaceable heaviness, and the usual symphony of crickets seemed muted, as though the night itself held its breath. David's footsteps echoed against the silence as he reached the edge of the fields. He tightened his grip on the lantern and forced himself forward. It's just a story, he muttered under his breath. Just a story, but deep down he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching him, waiting for something he could not name. The first stretch of his walk was uneventful, though the oppressive silence made his skin crawl. The faint glow of the lantern painted eerie shapes on the ground, and every now and then he would glance over his shoulder, sure he'd heard something, a rustle, a whisper, a breath. But there was nothing. Only the vast emptiness of the field stretching before him. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an otherworldly glow. It illuminated the damp earth, the slender stalks of young rice swaying in a wind David couldn't feel. He tried to focus on the task at hand, scanning the ground for movement. The frogs were out there, he could hear their sporadic croaks breaking the uneasy quiet. As he walked further, the unease deepened. The path he'd walked countless times before felt alien, as if the landscape itself had shifted in his absence. The sycamore tree, a familiar landmark, loomed ahead, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. David paused, gripping the lantern tighter. He could have sworn he saw a figure standing in its shadow. Hello, he called out, his voice shaky, despite his effort to sound firm. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. David's heart pounded as he stepped closer, the light from his lantern revealing nothing but an empty space. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Just the shadows, he whispered to himself, though the words felt hollow. Pressing on, David tried to shake the growing dread. He reminded himself of Eleanor and Peter, waiting at home. He thought of the empty pantry, of the hunger gnawing at them all. He couldn't let fear win. But the further he walked, the heavier the air seemed to grow, until it felt like a weight pressing down on his chest. When he finally reached the patties, relief washed over him. The familiar sound of frogs filled the air, a welcome distraction from the oppressive quiet of the journey. David knelt down, setting his lantern beside him. He worked quickly, his hands darting out to catch the slippery creatures. The simple, repetitive task helped to calm his racing heart. But then, the air shifted. The wind, which had been still moments ago, picked up, carrying with it that same mournful melody he'd heard earlier. David froze, his hands clutching a frog that squirmed in his grasp. The sound was faint, almost indistinct, but it sent a chill down his spine. He looked around, but the fields were empty, the shadows stretching long and dark under the moonlight. The melody grew louder, more distinct. It was a woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, singing words he couldn't understand. David's breath quickened. He stood, clutching his lantern, his eyes darting around the field. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The song stopped abruptly, leaving the air unnervingly silent. Then, from the corner of his eye, David saw her. A figure, pale and ghostly, standing at the edge of the field. She was too far away to make out clearly, but he could see the outline of a woman, her long hair billowing in the wind that had suddenly died. She was holding something, a bundle, perhaps a child close to her chest. David's blood ran cold. He wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of his home, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. She simply stood there, watching him. Gathering his courage, David took a tentative step forward, raising his lantern to get a better look. But as the light reached her, the figure vanished, dissolving into the mist like smoke. David's heart pounded as he stumbled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's not real," he muttered. "It's just a trick of the light," but deep down he knew better. The curse of Hollow Shade was no longer just a story. It was real, and it was watching him. Part 2. A desperate night. Driven by hunger and desperation, David tightened his belt and prepared himself for the night ahead. The pale moon hung low, casting a cold silver glow across the quiet village of Hollow Shade. Despite his wife Eleanor's protests, he knew they could not endure another night without food. The frogs in the field, small, plentiful, and easily caught, were their only hope of filling Peter's tiny stomach. "David, please," Eleanor whispered, clutching Peter close. The baby whimpered, his small fists weakly grasping at her dress. "There's something wrong out there. I've felt it for days. The stories. The things people have seen." Her voice cracked as she trailed off, her eyes wide and imploring. David turned to her, gripping her shoulders gently but firmly. "We'll be fine, Eleanor. I'll be back before you know it." He forced a smile, though his own nerves were beginning to fray. He couldn't let fear win. "Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Eleanor's lip quivered, but she nodded, pulling Peter closer. "Come back to us, David. Promise me." He hesitated, then leaned in to kiss her forehead. "I promise." The night air hit him like a wall of ice as he stepped outside, his lantern flickering against the gloom. The village seemed even quieter than usual, as though the very earth had stilled in anticipation. Shadows loomed long and jagged, stretching from the gnarled trees and crumbling fences that lined the path. David's boots crunched softly against the gravel, the sound unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. The path to the fields was one he knew well, yet tonight it felt unfamiliar, almost hostile. The trees, ancient and twisted, seemed to lean closer, their branches clawing at the sky. The wind whistled faintly through the leaves, carrying with it an unsettling melody, a faint, mournful tune that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. David shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. "It's just the wind," he muttered, gripping the lantern tighter. But the words felt hollow. The melody grew faint as he walked, but its haunting notes lingered in the back of his mind, an unwelcome reminder of the stories he had dismissed. Reaching the edge of the fields, David felt a flicker of relief. The familiar croaking of frogs broke the eerie stillness, their sporadic calls echoing across the moonlit paddies. Setting the lantern down, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. His hands moved quickly, darting out to catch the slippery creatures and dropping them into a burlap sack. The repetitive motion steadied his nerves, grounding him in the mundane task. As the minutes stretched into hours, his sack grew heavier, yet so did the unease that gnawed at the edges of his mind. The frogs' croaks seemed to falter, their once rhythmic calls fading into sporadic silences. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, and the air took on an unnatural stillness. Every rustle of the reeds felt like a whisper, every ripple in the water like a phantom's touch. David paused to wipe his brow, glancing toward the horizon. The lantern's light flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the damp earth. In the distance, the twisted outline of the old sycamore tree loomed, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like skeletal fingers. He avoided looking at it for too long. The stories about the tree were some of the darkest tales, of its roots feeding on sorrow and its branches holding secrets better left forgotten. As he crouched to catch another frog, the wind shifted abruptly. A chill swept through the air, sharper and colder than before, carrying with it that same mournful melody. The sound was clearer now, unmistakable. A woman's voice, soft and sorrowful, singing a tune that seemed to seep into the very marrow of his bones. David froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The frog slipped from his grasp, disappearing into the shadows, He rose slowly, turning in a circle, his eyes scanning the misty expanse of the field. The song seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere all at once, weaving through the reeds like an invisible specter. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling. The lantern trembled in his hand, its flame flickering wildly, as if in answer to his fear. The song stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw her. A figure stood at the far edge of the field, barely visible through the mist. She was pale, her long hair flowing in an unseen breeze. Her face was obscured, but even from a distance, David could see the outline of something in her arms. A child? A bundle? He couldn't tell. Her presence was both ethereal and deeply unsettling, as though she belonged to a world just beyond his own. David's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of his home, but his legs felt as if they were made of lead. The stories came rushing back to him: the weeping woman, the cursed fields, the spirits that wandered under the moonlight. He had dismissed them all as folklore, but now he wasn't so sure. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. She simply stood there, watching him. The air grew colder, the lantern's flame shrinking and flickering as if struggling to survive. David took a hesitant step forward, then another. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, but something about her held him in place, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and something he couldn't quite name. As he raised the lantern higher, its feeble light reached toward her. But before it could reveal her fully, she dissolved into the mist, vanishing as though she had never been there. The reeds swayed gently where she had stood, the only sign that anything had disturbed the stillness. David staggered back, his heart racing. He looked around frantically, but the field was empty. The frogs remained silent, the oppressive stillness pressing down on him like a weight. He stumbled toward his sack, his hands trembling as he picked it up. It felt heavier now, though he hadn't added anything to it. "It's not real," he muttered to himself, his voice shaking. Just a trick of the light. Just a trick of the light, but deep down he knew better. The walk back to the village felt endless. Every step was an effort, every shadow a threat. The wind whispered through the reeds, carrying faint echoes of the melody he had heard. He quickened his pace, glancing over his shoulder every few moments. But the path behind him was empty. When he finally reached his home, he was trembling so badly he could barely knock on the door. Eleanor's face appeared almost immediately, her eyes wide with worry. "David. Thank God. What happened? You're pale as a ghost." He stepped inside, setting the sack down with shaking hands. "Nothing," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Just the cold. Eleanor didn't look convinced, but she didn't press him. She took Peter from his arms, her gaze lingering on his face as if searching for answers. David sat down heavily, burying his face in his hands. The image of the pale figure lingered in his mind, her presence as real and chilling as the frost in the air. That night, as the wind wailed outside and the house creaked under its weight, David lay awake, holding Peter close. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching, waiting, and the frogs. The frogs never croaked again. Part 3. The woman and her child. David's heart still raced as he trudged further into the misty expanse of the fields. The pale figure's disappearance left a chill in the air that refused to dissipate. Each step felt heavier, as if unseen hands were trying to pull him back. The sack over his shoulder felt unnaturally weighty, but he dared not stop. He told himself it was fatigue, the night playing tricks on him. Yet deep down he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something, or someone, was watching him. The reeds swayed gently in the breeze, whispering secrets he could not understand. His lantern's dim light painted trembling shadows across the ground, distorting the landscape into something otherworldly. He had almost convinced himself to turn back when he saw her again. The woman stood just ahead, her figure more distinct this time. She cradled a child wrapped in tattered cloth, her long hair obscuring most of her face. Her pale skin seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight, and her movements were unnervingly still, as if she were caught between this world and another. David's breath hitched. He wanted to call out to her, to demand who she was and why she lingered in these cursed fields. But his voice failed him, his throat dry and tight. He could only watch as she turned slowly, her gaze fixing on him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. Though her face remained shadowed, he felt the weight of her eyes that seemed to pierce through him, seeing every fear, every doubt. She raised a hand, gesturing silently toward a cluster of trees on the edge of the field. There, nestled between the gnarled trunks, was a small, dilapidated shack. Its roof sagged under the weight of years, and its walls were warped and weathered. A faint light flickered within, barely visible through the cracks. David hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to run, but something about the woman's presence held him in place. She exuded a quiet sorrow that stirred a strange sense of empathy within him. Perhaps she needed help. Perhaps the child in her arms was sick or injured. He shook his head, trying to banish the rationalizations forming in his mind. This was no ordinary woman. Still, his legs moved forward, as if compelled by an unseen force. The woman turned and began to walk toward the shack, her steps unnaturally smooth, her figure gliding more than moving. David followed, each step feeling like a step deeper into a dream or a nightmare. When they reached the shack, the woman stopped at the threshold. She turned to him again, her gaze unreadable. Then, with deliberate slowness, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. David hesitated, his lantern trembling in his hand. The faint glow from within revealed little of the interior, only the vague outlines of sparse furnishings and shadowed corners. "Hello," David called, his voice barely above a whisper. The word felt swallowed by the thick air around him. The woman's silhouette reappeared in the doorway. She raised a hand, beckoning him inside. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and strangely hypnotic. Against every ounce of his better judgment, David stepped forward. The air inside the shack was stifling, heavy with an earthy, musty scent. The light came from a single candle placed on a crude wooden table. It flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. The woman stood near a threadbare hammock hanging in the corner. Within it lay the child, its tiny form barely discernible under the layers of cloth. David's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he took a hesitant step closer. The child did not move, its stillness unnerving. The woman stood over it, her back to him, her shoulders rising and falling in shallow breaths. "Is the child all right?" David asked, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she reached into a small basin of water on the table and began to wring out a cloth. Her movements were mechanical, almost ritualistic. David's unease deepened. He glanced around the room, noting its barren state. There were no belongings, no tools, no signs of daily life. The only objects in sight were the hammock, the table, and the candle. Even the walls were bare, save for the faint outlines of scratches as if something had clawed at the wood in desperation. "Mon," David tried again, his voice firmer this time. "Do you need help?" "Is the child?" He trailed off as the woman turned to face him. Her hair fell away, revealing a face that sent a jolt of terror through him. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were hollow voids, dark and bottomless. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't hear. The child in the hammock stirred, its small hand twitching beneath the cloth. David stumbled back, his lantern clattering to the floor. The flame flickered wildly before steadying, casting eerie shadows across the woman's face. She stepped closer, her movements slow but deliberate, as if time itself bent around her. Her gaze never left his, pinning him in place. The child let out a soft cry, a sound so faint it barely reached David's ears. The woman's expression shifted, her vacant eyes filling with something that might have been anguish. She turned back to the hammock, her hands trembling as she adjusted the cloth around the child. "Leave," she whispered, her voice low and strained, like the rustle of dry leaves. It was the first word she had spoken, and it sent a shiver down David's spine. "Leave before it's too late." David didn't need to be told twice. He stumbled toward the door, his movements frantic and clumsy. The night air hit him like a jolt of electricity as he burst outside, his lungs heaving. He didn't dare look back. Clutching his sack, he ran, the shadows stretching long and thin behind him. When he finally reached the edge of the fields, he stopped to catch his breath. The shack was no longer visible, hidden by the dense mist. But its presence lingered, an oppressive weight that pressed against his chest. David looked down at his hands, still trembling, and saw that they were damp. The lantern was gone, left behind in his haste, but his sack remained. He opened it, expecting to see the frogs he had spent the night catching. Instead, his stomach churned. The sack was empty, save for a handful of blackened, withered leaves. They crumbled to dust under his touch. David staggered back, his mind racing. The woman's voice echoed in his ears, "Leave before it's too late." He didn't know what she meant, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never set foot in those fields again. But the journey home did not end his torment. Every shadow seemed to stretch and contort into mocking shapes as he stumbled toward the safety of his cottage. The eerie melody that haunted the wind earlier now replayed faintly in his mind, its notes unnervingly clear, despite the absence of sound. David paused at the edge of his property, the flickering light from his home's window a beacon of comfort amidst the oppressive darkness. His legs trembled beneath him, his breath came in shallow bursts, but he forced himself forward. He had to see Eleanor and Peter. He needed the sight of them to ground him, to remind him that he was alive and that this nightmare was over. As he pushed open the door, Eleanor rushed to him, her face a mask of worry. "David, where have you been?" "You look." Her words trailed off as her gaze flicked over him, taking in his damp clothes, trembling hands, and the empty sack. David began, his voice cracking. He wanted to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He set the sack down and collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "It's nothing," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just." The cold Eleanor frowned but said nothing. She gently took Peter from his cradle and placed him in David's arms. The warmth of his son's small body steadied him, if only slightly. He clutched the child tightly, his eyes scanning the shadows that lingered outside the window. That night, sleep eluded him. The woman's hollow gaze and her whispered warning replayed endlessly in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, watching him from the mist, waiting for something he couldn't understand. And though he never returned to the fields, David knew that the curse of Hollow Shade had already taken root in his soul. Part 4. A House of Secrets. The interior of the shack was as lifeless as the figure who had led him there. David's first step inside was met with a sharp creak from the warped wooden floorboards, the sound magnified by the oppressive silence. The faint candlelight illuminated a room that seemed frozen in time, devoid of any signs of ordinary life. Dust clung to the air, swirling in lazy spirals around the lone flame. Every surface bore the wear of neglect, from the warped walls to the single wooden table marred by deep, erratic scratches. His eyes landed on the hammock in the corner, where the child lay wrapped in threadbare cloth. It was so still, so unnaturally quiet, that for a moment he thought it might not be alive. The woman moved to the hammock with mechanical precision, humming a haunting tune that sent a shiver down David's spine. The melody was soft, almost comforting, yet imbued with an otherworldly sorrow that seeped into his very bones. David's throat tightened as he took in the details of the room. There were no shelves, no tools, no belongings, nothing to suggest that anyone lived here. The walls, upon closer inspection, bore not just scratches but deep gouges, as if something had tried desperately to claw its way out. A small basin of water rested on the table, and next to it, a rusted knife with a jagged edge. The blade gleamed faintly in the candlelight, and David instinctively stepped back. "Who are you?" he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She stood over the hammock, her back to him, her long, matted hair obscuring her face. The child remained motionless beneath the tattered cloth, its form barely discernible. David's gaze lingered on the woman's hands as she dipped a cloth into the basin and wrung it out with deliberate slowness. Her fingers were thin, almost skeletal, and her nails were cracked and discolored. She began dabbing the cloth against the child's face, the motion rhythmic and unnervingly methodical. The tune she hummed never wavered, its mournful notes filling the air like a dirge. "Is the child sick?" David asked, his voice faltering. He wasn't sure why he spoke, perhaps to break the oppressive silence, or perhaps to convince himself that this was all just some strange but explainable situation. The woman paused for a moment, her head tilting slightly as if she were listening, but she didn't turn around. Instead, she resumed her task, her movements eerily calm. The candle flickered, casting long, shifting shadows across the walls. David's unease grew with each passing second. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. "Mom," he tried again, his tone more forceful. "Do you need help? Is there something I can?" Before he could finish, the child stirred. The movement was slight, a faint twitch of its tiny hand beneath the cloth, but it was enough to send a jolt through David. He took a step closer, his curiosity battling with his fear. The woman's humming grew louder, almost frantic, as if she were trying to drown out the creak of his approaching footsteps. "Let me see the child," David said, his voice trembling. He wasn't sure why he insisted. Perhaps it was the unnatural stillness of the room, or the way the woman's back seemed to hunch protectively over the hammock. Whatever the reason, he felt an inexplicable need to uncover the truth. The woman froze. For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move or make a sound. Then, slowly, she straightened and turned to face him. David's breath caught in his throat. Her face was even more unsettling up close. Her skin was ashen, almost translucent, with veins faintly visible beneath the surface. Her eyes were sunken and dark, devoid of any light or life. Her lips parted, and for a moment he thought she might speak. Instead, she stepped aside, revealing the hammock. David hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest. The child lay still beneath the cloth, its features obscured. The woman gestured toward it, her movements deliberate and slow. Her hollow eyes never left him, pinning him in place. Summoning his courage, David approached the hammock. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint scent of decay reached his nostrils. He reached out with trembling hands and peeled back the edge of the cloth. What he saw made him stagger backward, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. The child's face was pale and gaunt, its skin stretched tightly over its small, fragile bones. Its eyes were closed, but its lips were slightly parted, revealing teeth that seemed unnaturally sharp for an infant. The sight was grotesque, but what truly unnerved David was the faint, rhythmic rise and fall of its chest. The child was alive, but just barely. What is this?" David stammered, his voice cracking. He turned to the woman, his mind racing. "What's wrong with it? Why does it look like this?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she resumed her humming, her voice trembling as if she were fighting back tears. She moved to the table, picking up the rusted knife. David's pulse quickened as she turned back to the hammock, her movements slow but deliberate. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice rising. He stepped forward, his instincts screaming at him to intervene, but his body refused to obey. He watched in horror as the woman raised the knife, her hands trembling. The blade hovered over the child for what felt like an eternity. Then, she stopped. The knife clattered to the floor, the sound breaking the suffocating silence. The woman collapsed to her knees beside the hammock, her shoulders shaking as a guttural sob escaped her lips. The humming gave way to wails of despair, the sound raw and haunting. David backed away, his chest heaving. He had seen enough. Whatever this was, whatever she was, it was beyond his understanding. He turned and bolted for the door, the sound of the woman's cries echoing in his ears. The cold night air hit him like a jolt as he stumbled outside, his lungs burning. He didn't stop running until he reached the edge of the field. Only then did he dare to look back. The shack was barely visible through the mist, its faint candlelight flickering like a dying star. David swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he clutched the empty sack he had brought with him. The woman's cries still echoed in his mind as he made his way home, each step heavier than the last. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift around him, as if mocking his fear. By the time he reached his cottage, he was drenched in sweat despite the chill in the air. Eleanor met him at the door, her face etched with worry. "David, where have you been? You look like you've seen a ghost." He couldn't answer. He set the sack down and collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. The image of the child, the woman's hollow eyes, and the sound of her anguished wails haunted him. That night, sleep eluded him once again, and when he finally drifted off, his dreams were filled with the echoes of that cursed lullaby. Part 5. Vanished frogs, rising fear. David trudged home, the mist clinging to his clothes like a second skin. Each step felt heavier than the last, the haunting cries of the woman in the shack still echoing in his mind. His sack, once filled with the night's catch of frogs, now seemed unnaturally light. He tightened his grip on it, resisting the urge to peek inside. The thought of what he might find sent a shiver down his spine. By the time he reached the edge of the village, the first hints of dawn were beginning to creep into the sky. The familiar sight of his cottage should have brought comfort, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, clinging to the corners of his vision. The faint cries of his infant son, Peter, reached his ears as he approached the door, a sound that usually warmed his heart. Tonight it only deepened the unease twisting in his chest. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock, her face pale with worry. "David, where have you been? I've been waiting all night." Her voice was both a reprimand and a plea. She glanced at the sack in his hand, her expression softening with hope. "Did you catch anything?" "Peter's been crying nonstop. He's so hungry." David hesitated, his hands trembling. I don't know," he murmured, his voice barely audible. He stepped inside, the warmth of the cottage doing little to dispel the chill that had seeped into his bones. Setting the sack down on the table, he untied the drawstring with trembling fingers. Eleanor stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the bag. She let out a small gasp as he upended it, the contents spilling out onto the wooden surface. Instead of frogs, blackened soil poured out in a dry, crumbling heap. The air grew thick with the scent of decay, sharp and acrid. David stumbled back, his heart pounding. No, that's not possible," he stammered, his voice shaking. "I caught them. I saw them. They were there." Eleanor covered her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "What is this, David? What's happening?" Before he could answer, Peter's cries grew louder, a piercing wail that cut through the suffocating tension. Eleanor turned toward the cradle, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "I'll calm him," she said, her voice trembling. David followed her to the cradle, his steps hesitant. Peter's tiny face was red with exertion, his fists flailing as he wailed uncontrollably. Eleanor picked him up, cradling him close to her chest and murmuring soft words of comfort. But the moment David stepped closer, Peter's cries intensified, his small body writhing as if in distress. "Peter," David said softly, reaching out to touch his son's tiny hand. The instant his fingers brushed the baby's skin, Peter let out a blood-curdling scream. Eleanor flinched, pulling the baby away from David instinctively. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice edged with panic. "He's never reacted like this before." "I don't know," David whispered, his hand frozen in midair. A deep sense of dread settled over him, heavier than anything he had felt in the shack. "I don't understand." Peter's cries continued unabated, his small body trembling. Eleanor rocked him gently, tears welling in her eyes. "Something's wrong, David. He's never cried like this before. It's like he's afraid of you." David stepped back, his chest tightening. "That's not possible. I'm his father." But even as he said the words, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. The woman's warning echoed in his memory: "Leave before it's too late." He backed away from the cradle, his heart racing. Peter's cries began to soften the moment he put distance between them, though his tiny body still shook with residual sobs. Eleanor turned to David, her expression torn between confusion and fear. "What happened out there?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not telling me everything. Did you see something? Did something happen to you?" David hesitated, his mind racing. He wanted to tell her about the shack, about the woman and the child, about the blackened soil that now sat where the frog should have been. But the words caught in his throat. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? "I don't know," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I don't know what's happening." Eleanor's eyes searched his face, her expression softening with concern. "You need to rest," she said gently. "You're pale as a ghost. I'll take care of Peter. Just try to get some sleep." David nodded numbly, his legs carrying him to the small bed in the corner of the room. He lay down, his mind swirling with fragmented images: the woman's hollow eyes, the child's pale face, the blackened soil spilling from the sack. Sleep did not come easily, and when it did, it brought no relief. His dreams were filled with the haunting melody of the woman's lullaby, the mournful tune weaving through his subconscious like a dark thread. He saw Peter crying, his tiny hands reaching for Eleanor while recoiling from David's touch. He saw the woman in the shack, her lips moving soundlessly as she cradled her lifeless child. And beneath it all, he felt the cold, unrelenting weight of something unseen, something that had followed him home. When he awoke, the room was bathed in the dim light of dawn. Eleanor sat by the cradle, her face drawn with exhaustion. Peter was asleep in her arms, his small chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. David rose slowly, his body aching as if he had run for miles. Eleanor looked up as he approached, her eyes filled with worry. "David," she began, her voice hesitant. "Something's not right. I can feel it. It's like there's something in this house." David nodded, his throat dry. "I know," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I felt it too." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken fears. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift and stretch, their presence almost palpable. For the first time in his life, David felt truly powerless, caught in the grip of something far beyond his understanding. "We'll figure this out," he said finally, his voice trembling. "We have to." But even as he spoke, he couldn't shake the feeling that their nightmare was only just beginning. Part 6. The haunting begins. The days that followed were a waking nightmare. David awoke each morning with a growing sense of dread, the sunlight doing little to banish the darkness that seemed to cling to him. The air in their small cottage felt heavier, as though it carried an unseen weight. The events of that fateful night in the fields played over and over and over in his mind, each fragment of memory filling him with a gnawing fear he couldn't explain. Peter's health began to decline rapidly. The once lively infant who would giggle and coo now lay silent for most of the day, his small frame pale and fragile. His cries, when they did come, were piercing and relentless, often starting without warning in the dead of night. Eleanor did her best to soothe him, but no amount of rocking or gentle whispers seemed to help. Worse, the child recoiled from David, as though his very presence caused Peter pain. "I don't know what to do," Eleanor admitted one evening, tears streaming down her face as she held the child close. "He won't eat. He won't sleep. It's like he's slipping away from us." David could only watch helplessly, the words catching in his throat. Every time he tried to approach, Peter's cries would escalate into a frantic, almost inhuman wail, forcing him to retreat. The distance between father and son grew with each passing day, and with it, David's guilt and fear. The crops, too, began to wither. Stalks of wheat that had been strong and golden turned brittle and gray, crumbling to dust beneath the slightest touch. The villagers whispered among themselves, their glances at David and his family becoming increasingly wary. Some claimed it was a blight, others spoke of ill fortune, but the older villagers exchanged knowing looks and muttered about curses. "It's not natural," an elder remarked to David one morning, his voice low but firm. "Whatever shadow you've brought back with you, it's poisoning the land." David bristled at the accusation, but deep down he couldn't dismiss it entirely. The memory of the woman in the shack, her hollow eyes and haunting lullaby, lingered in his mind like a specter. He had tried to convince himself that it had all been a dream, a figment of his imagination brought on by exhaustion, but the evidence was all around him, undeniable and unrelenting. Then the lullaby returned. It started softly, barely more than a whisper on the wind. David first heard it while tending to the dying crops, the mournful tune floating through the air and sending a chill down his spine. He froze, his hands gripping the brittle stalks as he strained to listen. The melody was faint, but unmistakable, the same haunting song the woman had hummed in the shack. He turned sharply, scanning the horizon for any sign of the source, but the fields were empty, the mist curling lazily around the withered plants. His heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled back toward the cottage, his mind racing. The song followed him, growing louder with each step, as though the unseen singer was drawing closer. By the time he reached the door, the lullaby had stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. David burst inside, his breaths ragged. Eleanor looked up from where she sat by Peter's cradle, her expression alarmed. "What's wrong?" she asked, rising to her feet. "I heard it," David said, his voice trembling. "The song. Her song. She's here." Eleanor's face paled, her gaze darting toward the windows. "David, don't say that. You'll scare Peter." "I'm not imagining it," he insisted, his hands clenching into fists. "It's real. She's real. And she's not going to leave us alone that night." The lullaby returned, louder and closer than ever. The mournful melody seemed to seep through the walls, filling every corner of the cottage with its eerie tune. Peter began to cry, his small voice trembling with fear, and Eleanor rocked him desperately, her own tears streaming down her face. David sat by the window, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared into the darkness beyond the glass, his eyes searching for any sign of movement. The shadows outside seemed to shift and writhe, as though something was lurking just beyond the edge of the lamplight. "Why won't she leave us alone?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over Peter's cries. What does she want? David didn't answer. He didn't know. All he knew was that the presence he had felt in the fields had followed him home, and it wasn't going to stop. The lullaby continued long into the night, a relentless reminder of the curse that had taken hold of their lives. By morning, the shadows in the cottage felt darker, heavier. The once warm sunlight that streamed through the windows now seemed dim and cold, as though even the light had been tainted by the presence. Peter's cries had subsided, but his small body lay limp in Eleanor's arms, his breath shallow and labored. David knelt beside them, his heart breaking as he reached out to touch his son's hand. This time, Peter didn't recoil, but his tiny fingers were cold to the touch, his skin pale and clammy. "He's getting worse," Eleanor said, her voice cracking. "David, we have to do something. We can't just let him slip away." "We will," David promised, though the words felt hollow. "We'll figure it out." But even as he said it, the haunting melody began to drift through the air once more, its mournful tune carrying a message he couldn't ignore. The spirits were closing in and time was running out. Part 7. The Grave's Truth. Desperation gnawed at David like a feral beast. Days of sleepless nights and the relentless haunting had left him frayed, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse. The woman's lullaby was no longer confined to the night. Its mournful melody seeped into his thoughts during the day, echoing in the silence of the withered fields and even in the rare quiet moments inside the cottage. Eleanor grew gaunter, her eyes hollow with exhaustion as she cradled Peter, whose shallow breath seemed to slow with each passing hour. "We can't keep going like this," Eleanor whispered one evening, her voice trembling as she gazed at their son's pale face. "David, please. We need answers." David's heart clenched. He had no answers to give, only questions that spiraled endlessly in his mind. What did the woman want? Why had she chosen them? And what was it about her song that sent shivers crawling over his skin? But there was one place he hadn't dared to revisit: the shack. That night, as the house creaked under the weight of the relentless wind and the lullaby grew louder, David made his decision. He kissed Peter's cold forehead and touched Eleanor's trembling shoulder. "I'll be back," he said, his voice firm despite the dread curling in his gut. "I have to go back to the fields." Eleanor's eyes widened with fear. "No, David. You don't know what's out there. You don't know what she might do." "She's already here," David replied grimly. "I need to find out why." With a lantern in hand, David stepped into the night. The mist swirled around him, thick and heavy, as if the darkness itself sought to keep him from his destination. His boots crunched against the brittle soil, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. The air felt colder than it should have, each breath frosting in the chill. As he approached the edge of the field, David strained his eyes for the familiar silhouette of the shack. But as the fog parted, his heart sank. The shack was gone. In its place stood a single grave, its edges worn and crumbling as if it had been there for centuries. The headstone, weathered and cracked, leaned precariously to one side. Moss and grime obscured the inscription, leaving only faint, illegible etchings. David's breath caught in his throat. His lantern's glow flickered against the gravestone, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and twist. The realization struck him with the force of a hammer blow. The woman and the child were never alive. They were spirits, bound to this place by sorrow and suffering. "Why?" he whispered, his voice breaking. "Why us? What do you want?" As if in answer, the lullaby began again, louder than ever. It rose from the earth itself, the notes trembling through the ground and into David's bones. He staggered backward, clutching his lantern as the mist thickened, obscuring everything but the grave. The shadows around the headstone grew darker, denser, until they coalesced into a familiar figure. The woman stood before him, her pale form flickering like a flame. The child was in her arms, its tiny face still and serene. Her eyes, hollow and black as the void, locked onto David's. He felt paralyzed under her gaze, his heart pounding as fear and sorrow washed over him in equal measure. "I'm sorry," David whispered, though he didn't know what he was apologizing for. The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. She stepped closer, the hem of her tattered dress trailing over the soil like mist. "Why are you doing this?" he pleaded, his voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" The woman's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, she raised a skeletal hand and pointed toward the grave. David followed her gesture, his lantern illuminating the inscription, as though an unseen hand wiped away the grime. The faint letters carved into the stone sent a chill through him. "For the lost, for the forgotten. A mother's sorrow binds her still." David's knees buckled as the truth settled over him. She was not haunting them out of malice. She was mourning. The bond between her and her child had never been broken, even in death. Her sorrow had seeped into the land, poisoning it, tethering her spirit to the earth. And now, that sorrow had reached out to ensnare his family. The lullaby swelled, its mournful notes wrapping around him like a shroud. David's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. He dropped to his knees before the grave, the lantern slipping from his grasp. "I don't know how to help you," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do." The woman stood motionless, her gaze unyielding. Then, she reached down and placed her hand on his shoulder. The touch was cold, like the air before a storm, but it carried a weight of unspoken emotion. For a moment, the lullaby softened, its melody tinged with something close to gratitude. When David looked up, the woman and the child were gone. The grave remained, silent and foreboding, but the oppressive presence that had clung to him felt lighter, as if the air itself had released a long-held breath. David stumbled back toward the cottage, his steps unsteady. The night seemed less dark, the mist less suffocating. When he reached the door, Eleanor met him with wide, questioning eyes. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice trembling. David nodded, though he wasn't sure how to explain. "It's her sorrow," he said simply. "She's bound by it. But I think she let go." At least a little. Eleanor held Peter close, her face etched with worry and hope. "Do you think we're safe now?" David didn't answer. He didn't know. But for the first time in days, the silence around them felt like a blessing rather than a curse. As he sat by the fire, holding his son's tiny hand, he resolved to honor the unspoken promise he had made at the grave, to remember her story and carry it with him. A testament to the power of love and loss. Part 8. The final encounter. The lullaby returned that night, louder than ever before. Its melody seemed to rise from the very walls of the cottage, a mournful song that filled every corner of the small home. The notes carried a weight that pressed down on David, Eleanor, and Peter, heavy and suffocating. The fire in the hearth, once a comforting glow, flickered weakly, as if struggling against the oppressive darkness that seeped into the room. Peter's cries had started earlier in the evening, sharp and frantic, as if he could sense the storm brewing around them. Eleanor held him tightly, her face pale and streaked with tears as she rocked him back and forth. "Please, Peter," she whispered. "Please stop crying," but the child's wails grew louder, echoing the rising crescendo of the haunting lullaby. David paced the room, his fists clenched and his heart pounding in his chest. He had thought the visit to the grave might have brought them some measure of peace, but the woman's sorrow had returned with a vengeance, and it was now stronger than ever. "Why won't she leave us alone?" Eleanor sobbed, her voice trembling. "What more does she want?" David didn't answer. He didn't know. He stared at the window, where the darkness outside seemed to shift and writhe, as though it were alive. The shadows pressed against the glass, thick and impenetrable, cutting them off from the rest of the world. They were trapped, isolated, and at the mercy of whatever force had claimed their lives. Then, without warning, Peter's cry stopped. The sudden silence was deafening. Eleanor froze, her eyes wide with fear as she looked down at her son. Peter lay limp in her arms, his tiny chest still. "David," she whispered, her voice breaking. "David, he's not breathing." David rushed to her side, his hands trembling as he reached for Peter. But the moment his fingers brushed the child's cold skin, a voice filled the room, a ghostly whisper, low and guttural, that sent chills racing down his spine. "Your love cannot save him." The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It reverberated through the walls, the floor, and the air itself, filling the space with an unholy presence. David stumbled back, his eyes darting around the room. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "What do you want?" The shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into a form that hovered in the corner. The woman appeared, her pale figure flickering like a dying flame. The child was in her arms, as still and lifeless as Peter. Her hollow eyes locked onto David's, filled with an anguish that seemed to pierce his very soul. Eleanor let out a choked sob, clutching Peter tightly. "Please," she begged. "Please, don't take him. He's just a baby." The woman tilted her head, her expression unreadable. She took a step forward, her movement slow and deliberate, the hem of her tattered dress brushing against the floor. The air grew colder with each step she took, and the fire in the hearth sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. David reached for Eleanor, pulling her and Peter closer to him as he stood between them and the spirit. "Leave us alone," he shouted, his voice breaking. "Haven't you done enough?" The woman stopped, her gaze shifting to the child in Eleanor's arms. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. Then, the lullaby began again, softer this time, its melody laced with sorrow and regret. David's breath caught in his throat as the woman raised a skeletal hand and pointed at Peter. The whisper returned, clearer now, resonating with a mournful clarity. "His time is not yet. But the price must be paid." "What price?" David demanded, his voice trembling. "What are you talking about?" The woman didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Peter. The lullaby swelled, its notes wrapping around David and Eleanor like a suffocating embrace. The shadows seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against them with an almost physical force. Desperation surged within David. He dropped to his knees, his hands clasped together as he pleaded with the spirit. "Please," he begged. "Take me instead. Whatever you want, whatever you need. Just leave my family alone." The woman paused, her head tilting as if considering his words. The room fell silent once more, the oppressive stillness broken only by the sound of Eleanor's quiet sobs. Finally, the woman lowered her hand and turned her gaze back to David. "The bond is eternal," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "You cannot break it. But you can carry it." David's heart pounded in his chest as the woman extended her hand toward him. He hesitated, fear and determination warring within him. Then, with a deep breath, he reached out and took her hand. The moment their hands touched, a surge of cold energy shot through him, freezing him to his core. His vision blurred and the room around him seemed to dissolve into darkness. He felt the weight of the woman's sorrow, her anguish, and her love for her child pouring into him, filling every corner of his being. When the darkness lifted, the woman and her child were gone. The room was quiet, the air still. The fire in the hearth flickered back to life, casting a warm glow over the cottage. David opened his eyes to find Eleanor staring at him, her expression a mixture of relief and fear. Peter stirred in her arms, letting out a soft, weak cry. Eleanor gasped, clutching him tightly as tears streamed down her face. "He's breathing," she whispered. "David, he's breathing." David sank to the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The weight of the spirit's sorrow still lingered within him, a heavy burden he would carry for the rest of his life. But Peter was alive, and for that, he would endure anything. As the night gave way to dawn, the shadows outside the cottage receded, and the air grew lighter. The lullaby was gone, its haunting melody a memory that would never fade. David knew the spirit's presence would always remain, a bond forged in sorrow and love. But for now, his family was safe, and that was all that mattered. Part 9. Eternal Echoes. By morning, the cottage was silent. The oppressive air that had once clung to the home like a shroud was gone, but so too was any sign of life. The villagers, wary of the family's plight, had grown accustomed to the unnatural stillness emanating from David's home. That morning, however, a strange unease rippled through the village. Something had changed. Old Martha, the midwife, was the first to notice. Her weathered eyes narrowed as she stared at the faint plume of smoke rising from where the family's chimney should have been visible. She had seen that smoke every morning without fail, a comforting sign of life inside the cottage. Today, the smoke spiraled unnaturally upward, before vanishing into the still air, as though it carried a message. "Something's wrong," she muttered to herself, gripping her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She turned to the blacksmith's apprentice, a young man whose wide-eyed curiosity mirrored her unease. "Go fetch the others. We need to check on them." It didn't take long for a small group to gather at the edge of the field that led to David's home. The once vibrant path was now overgrown. The earth cracked and scorched as though it had been burned by an invisible fire. The villagers hesitated, whispering among themselves as they approached the cottage. The structure stood intact, but its walls seemed darker, its roof sagging under an unseen weight. The air around it was unnaturally cold, and the faint echo of a melody drifted on the wind, a lullaby that sent chills down their spines. The blacksmith, a burly man with more courage than sense, was the first to step forward. "Stay here," he said, his voice gruff but unsteady. "I'll take a look." He pushed open the door with a hesitant hand, his breath visible in the frigid air that seeped from within. The inside of the cottage was in disarray. The hearth was cold, its ashes undisturbed. The table and chairs were overturned, as though abandoned in haste. And in the center of the room, the ground was cracked and blackened, a strange circle of charred earth marking the spot where something unholy had occurred. But there was no sign of David, Eleanor, or Peter. The blacksmith backed out of the cottage, his face pale as he shook his head. "They're gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All of them. It's like they vanished." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. They had known something was wrong with the family, had whispered of curses and hauntings, but this was beyond anything they had imagined. The lullaby, faint but persistent, continued to drift through the air, its mournful tune weaving through their thoughts and filling them with dread. "What do we do?" Martha asked, her voice trembling. "We can't just leave it like this. What if it spreads?" The blacksmith looked toward the cottage, his expression grim. "We leave it be," he said finally. "Whatever happened here, it's not our place to interfere. This is something beyond us." And so the villagers turned away, their fear outweighing their curiosity. They spoke in hushed tones as they made their way back to the safety of the village, their eyes darting nervously toward the cottage. None dared to approach it again. In the days that followed, the cottage became a place of whispered tales and avoided paths. The land around it grew darker, the earth dry and lifeless. The crops closest to the field withered, their leaves curling inward as though recoiling from an unseen presence. The lullaby, once faint, grew louder at night, its melody carrying on the wind and reaching the ears of those who dared to listen. Children were told to stay away, and even the bravest among the villagers avoided the area. But the story spread beyond Hollowshade, carried by travelers and traders. They spoke of the cursed family and the ghostly song that haunted the field. Some said the woman's spirit still lingered, bound to the earth by sorrow and loss. Others believed the family had been taken as part of a bargain, their lives exchanged for a fragile peace. Years passed, and the cottage began to crumble. Its walls sagged, its roof collapsed, and the forest crept closer, reclaiming the land. But the lullaby remained. On quiet nights when the wind was still and the stars shone brightly, the villagers could hear it, a mournful tune that seemed to rise from the earth itself, carrying with it the weight of a mother's love and grief. The villagers attempted rituals and prayers to cleanse the land, calling on priests and shamans to banish the lingering spirit. But each effort was met with failure. The lullaby would grow quieter for a time, only to return, stronger and more sorrowful than before. It became clear that whatever tethered the spirit to the land was beyond mortal intervention. The villagers could only accept it as part of their lives, a haunting backdrop to their quiet existence. Some villagers claimed to see her, the pale woman in the distance, cradling a child wrapped in shadows. She would appear at the edge of the fields, her figure faint and translucent under the moonlight. Those who ventured too close would speak of an overwhelming sadness that seeped into their hearts, a sorrow so profound it left them unable to speak for days. Others swore they could feel her presence in the forest, the air turning cold and still as her lullaby brushed against their ears. David, Eleanor, and Peter were never seen again. Their story became legend, a cautionary tale of love, sacrifice, and the unrelenting power of sorrow. The villagers spoke of them in whispers, their names etched into the memory of Hollowshade like a scar. It was said that David's final act, offering himself in a desperate bid to save his family, had bound his spirit to the land, forever entwined with the woman and her child. And though the cottage was eventually swallowed by the forest, the melody lingered, a haunting echo that would never fade. The woman's lullaby became a part of the land, a reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there, and the bond that could not be broken, even in death. Eternal echoes, carried on the wind, told their story to those who dared to listen, a tale of love and loss, of sorrow and sacrifice, and of the unyielding grip of the past. To this day, travelers avoid the path that leads to the ruined cottage, and the villagers avert their eyes, for the song that drifts through the air is not merely a warning but a lament, a testament to the eternal bond of a grieving mother and the family caught in her sorrowful embrace.